Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Business Insights with Mr. Kerridge. I'm delighted to welcome Carl Rutter with us today, who's going to share some of his insights into the role of trade unions and how that's changed over time. Before we get into that, thanks for joining us, Carl. Thanks for giving up your time.
You're welcome, Matt.
Just before we get into the role of trade unions and start to discuss that and unpick it, could you just provide the students a little bit of background in terms of your experience and your role in business?
So I worked in large financial institutions, financial services institutions for nearly 40 years, the last 20 in employee relations and industrial relations. And for the last 10 years of my career, before I retired this year, I worked 10 years for a trade union.
Thank you for that. Excellent. Could you provide the students a little bit of background in terms of what is a trade union, what's their role, and maybe how that's changed over your career?
Believe it or not, the trade union movement started 200 years ago in the 1820s. And it's fair to say it does look a lot different 200 years later than it did then. What does a trade union do? Well, a trade union does two main things. It supports the employees of a particular company in negotiating and bargaining on their behalf, the broad terms of their pay and their terms and conditions. So their terms and conditions may be their hours of work, their holidays, their overtime. So they would negotiate with the company on behalf of the employees those terms and conditions. In addition to that, where individual employees or members have a dispute that they individually may have, whether that is a lady on maternity leave who may feel she's being disadvantaged, it may be someone who feels they have been discriminated against because of their race or their sex or their disability, the way their manager treats them, we would support them with those disputes as well. So one is an overall collective responsibility for negotiating big issues like pay for everybody. The other is for helping individuals if they have any individual disputes whilst they're in that employ.
Thank you for that, Carl. That's really interesting. In terms of these negotiations happening, where they break down, our students will learn about things such as strike action in the most extreme term, but some actions that the employee can take and how that works with the trade union practice. How quickly do you get to a strike? You hear things such as go slows and working to rule. What's that like in practice?
So I would say in the industry I worked in, which was financial services, which was banking and insurance, I can say in the 20 years I've worked in employee relations and for trade unions, we have never got to a position where there has been a strike. But that's in the particular industry that I worked in. To be honest, I don't think it would be a great look for bank workers to go on strike. It may not feel right. So as a trade union, we always wanted to negotiate the best possible deal we could. In any event, certainly in the UK, you can't go on strike now unless more than 50% of the members who vote in a ballot say they want to go on strike. So the days, and you asked, I think, about what's changed, the days when there was a show of hands where men in the main, sometimes, but men in the main, would get together and they would be in a big room and put their hands up as to whether they wanted to go on strike or not, that's long gone. That's from 30, 40, 50 years ago now. It's much more about trying to negotiate a fair deal and then putting it to members. So from a personal point of view, I have never been involved in a strike from our point of view, or for instance, I think you mentioned a lockout for employees from the employer, never been involved in that. But of course, there are some industries where strikes still do happen. And in the UK, at the moment, transport would be one of those. So trains, London tubes, there's lots of recent history where train drivers have gone on strike. So it's not that it doesn't happen anymore. If you look back at trade unions and employee relations in the 1960s and 70s, there would have been millions of days lost throughout, certainly the UK, of people going on strike. Now that number is very, very small because both trade unions and employers want to negotiate deals so that it's beneficial for all concerned. Of course, you don't always get to that stage, but that in nearly all industries now is the way that modern trade unionism works with employers.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting in terms of looking over time, how it's maybe changed from where there's been that extreme action of striking to really get into a position of this idea of collective bargaining, which is mutually beneficial really for both sides. So thank you for that. Just taking it on a step, in terms of the employer and the employee, what typically in your experience determines who has the most power and influence in them sort of negotiations, or how does that typically work? Does one party typically have more power than the other, or vice versa?
So again, if you want to look at recent history, let's look at the last 50 years. You probably would have argued in the 1960s and the 70s, because of the way industrial relations were carried out, and because in most manufacturing industries, such as mines, steel, shipbuilding, when they were very the trade unions were very powerful, and the law allowed them to go on strike very quickly. And therefore, I would have said 30, 40, 50 years ago, the trade unions and the men and women who worked for those trade unions had the upper hand, because the employer very quickly wanted them to get back to work. There was, again in the UK, there was a big miners' strike in the 70s and the 80s. And I think the government then, and the mine people who own the mines, the miners went on strike, but were on strike for a year. And they ran out of money. The trade unions ran out of money. And the employers were not bothered about getting them back. And what happened in the end is that everybody lost on that. So in the last 20 years, and certainly the last 20 years, there's been much more of a view of trying to negotiate without the need for industrial action, if at all. Now, as I said earlier, sort of half jokingly, bank workers don't tend to go on strike. Why? Because you could argue that there wouldn't be a lot of sympathy from the public for bank workers to go on strike, rightly or wrongly. But if you have, so that'd be one part about the PR empathy, sympathy part from the public. The second bit would be, of course, why the tube train drivers and the train drivers have some power now is that if they stop the trains running by going on strike, people can't get to work, people can't get into their place of work, become economically active, and that starts to hurt not just the train company, but it starts to hurt lots of other things. Whether it affects other people as well as their own company, and whether the general public think that they would be ethic towards those people going on strike.
Thank you for that. It's really fascinating in terms of that insight there, and looking at different areas of the economy. I just wanted to touch on one area our students look at in terms of arbitration and what that looks like, and avoiding getting to tribunals, and how arbitration works at a simple level.
Yeah, so if an individual has a dispute, it could be that they have been dismissed and maybe unfairly. So let's take that one. So if someone is dismissed from a company and we look at those facts and think that that person has been dismissed unfairly, we would appeal that initially on behalf of the employee. And if that didn't win, he or she then has the opportunity to go to what is called an industrial tribunal. But before that, there is now what is called arbitration or conciliation, where the two parties representing the individual and usually the HR team representing the employer get together to see if they can come to some agreement. And that's done certainly in the UK under the auspices of a company called an organisation called ACAS. And they are an independent organisation who act on being arbitrators, conciliators for employers and employees. They're not on one side or the other. They try and bring the two parties together to come to some resolution before it finishes up in a court of law.
In your experience, because of the legal fees involved in moving it to a tribunal, that it typically now gets settled through arbitration and conciliation rather than typically getting to a tribunal?
Yes, so I can clearly say that both trade unions and the employers, in the vast majority of time, want to settle any individual dispute before going to a court. That's absolutely the case, because one of the reasons is it's stressful for both parties. So those meetings to try and resolve prior to going to court are very important. And my experience, and I can only talk about me, 9 times out of 10, there will be some form of settlement before a court case.
Okay. Thank you for that, Carl. That's been really interesting in terms of where we've looked at in terms of what is the role of a trade union, maybe how that's changed over time, the action that the employer can take, the action that the employee can take, this idea of conciliation and arbitration, and you've given some really interesting insights, different parts of the economy. One last question I'd like to finish on, based on your experience and looking at over time. Would you say that trade unions still have a role? Are they still relevant today?
The first interesting part is that trade unions have become much more relevant for professional people. So if you think about doctors, nurses, trained drivers on earning very good sums of money, they're already, lawyers have their own trade unions. So for the professions, they already have, they may not call them trade unions always, they may call them their professional bodies, but in effect, they are, for the professional people, their trade unions. I think the second part, which will be interesting, as companies globally like Amazon employ more and more people, and many of those people working for Amazon are working on relatively low wages, sometimes quite flexible contracts, which are often at the favourite, that it favours the employer more. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a concerted effort from trade unions to help and support those individuals to have a collective voice so that they can improve their terms and conditions over a period of time. So one, at the very professional level, people are already well organised and have their trade unions and have their bodies, and maybe at more of the lower levels and the lower paid levels, where trade unions have probably lost most members over the last 30, 40 years. I hope there will be a resurgence of people seeing that trade unionism is relevant to them in trying to improve their terms and conditions over the years ahead. And it may be, and none of us know, I know we're sitting here while the coronavirus is still prevalent, none of us know what the effects of the coronavirus is going to be to employment, to our terms and conditions, and to the world of work. So I think there's going to be many more interesting changes in the years to come.
Well, thank you for that. I'm sure the students will find it really interesting, the insight you've given. It's a great starting point for them to start to unpick and look at some of the things you've mentioned around what is a trade union, what is their role, how has it changed, how you can actually represent the employees' rights, what the employer can do, who has the stronger influence in disputes. Now that's changed and we've moved to a much more mutual collective position. So thank you very much for that. And this idea of arbitration is really interesting for the students, and avoiding getting to a tribunal and the legal costs and management time that would be tied up with that. So thank you, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to speak to you again as things move on and check in and see what has happened to the role of trade unions. So thank you.
Thank you.